Уважаемые делегаты конференции, будущее человечества.
So, dear delegates and dear Helga, LaRouche, and it's a great honor for me to speak to this conference about the role of LaRouche's teachings for solving the problems of the world as a whole and particular continents, Eurasia, or specific countries like Ukraine. This is my first address to a Schiller Institute conference since the death of the patriot of planet Earth, outstanding person, the world-renowned economist, philosopher, and political and public figure, Lyndon LaRouche. I am proud that for nearly a quarter of a century, in various forms, I was able to listen to the great LaRouche, to see him at conferences where we could discuss social, economic, and geopolitical processes, as well as to spend time at the home of Lynn and Helga, a family living at a very high intellectual level. I am grateful that I was able not to only be acquainted, but to be friends with these unique people. The great Lynn has left us, but his teachings, the powerful light of his ideas remain. Likewise, the planet Earth still has problems, and these problems are growing in an ominous way to an explosive level, and Lyndon LaRouche has forecasted and warned about this. In particular, at the Forum for the Unity of Europe, How to Restore Trust, which was organized in January 2019 in Moscow by the International Slavic Academy of Sciences, Education, Arts and Culture. In my lecture, Towards a United Europe Through a Paradigm Shift, in the search for solutions to problems of modern Europe, I utilized the ideas of Nicolas of Cusa and Vladimir Vernadsky and Lyndon LaRouche, which is published in the journal The Slavs, this year, and the analytical methodology is extraordinarily important because it is scientific and has been confirmed in practice. I do not know of any other scholar in the world who could forecast financial crisis as precisely as Lynn did, both in the world economy as a whole and in individual countries. I believe that the works of Lyndon LaRouche on the methodology of economic studies, as well as his specific proposals for changing the nature and the role of the international institutions that determine the existing world order, and his proposals for reorganizing the world and creating an entirely different world order, should be a separate subject for study by students at all leading universities in the world. The precision of LaRouche's forecasts and his meticulous treatment of the problems of national economies are clearly demonstrated in the case of my country, Ukraine. Ukraine was one of the most advanced republics of the former Soviet Union. Recently, just in 1991, it was a prosperous and progressively developing country. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was among the top 10 countries of the world and had a GDP that was greater than Portugal, Argentina, Poland, and Ukraine was among the top 6, I repeat this, 6 countries in the world possessing full cycle production capacities for making aircraft, and had highly advanced modern shipbuilding, diesel engine building, automobile including buses and missiles, and agricultural implemented industries. We had no unemployment. We had skill training growth and labor force growth, and in June 1992, Ukraine joined the International Monetary Fund and agreed to implement all the conditionalities dictated by the IMF for credits that were issued. And Vladimir Marchenko and myself arrived to the Schiller Institute conference in Washington in February 1995 and reported that a discussion was underway in Ukraine about a government reform program which the parliament was to approve. And Lynn and Helga were not indifferent to the inevitable catastrophe facing our country. And at that time, we represented the Socialist Party of Ukraine, SPU, and Alexander Moroz, its leader, was Speaker of the Parliament. And our socialist fraction and him personally determined the reforms in Ukraine, especially insofar as Ukrainian economists and economic managers were torpedoing the IMF's monetarist colonial prescriptions within the country, especially supporting LaRouche's theory of physical economy and advocating a policy under which the development of material production would be decisive. First, the Schiller Institute sent its representatives, Michael Witt and Denis Small, to Ukraine. And I'm very happy to see Denis Small 24 years later after that first meeting of ours. And in May 1995, Denis Small and Michael Witt met the party activists of Ukraine, the SPU, and in June 1995, Lyndon and Helga were in Kiev, where a meeting was arranged between them and the Speaker of the Parliament. And as a participant of that meeting, I witnessed how convincingly and in what a well-argued fashion LaRouche urged Moroz not to accept the IMF loans and to refrain from implementing reforms according to the IMF recipes. Unfortunately, Moroz's moral qualities and intellectual level prevented him from taking the advice of the great American economists and scientists, just as LaRouche has warned, the Ukrainian catastrophe became irreversible, even though we had a chance, a real historical chance, to prevent this terrible destruction of the economy and the impoverishment and dying out of the population. Unfortunately, the inability to realize the magnitude of the threats and to choose a pathway of national salvation is not just a problem to Moroz and the Ukrainian political elite. It's a problem of the political elites in practically every country in the world, with the exception of China. As a result, because of their failure to understand fundamental socio-economic and financial processes and to take responsibility for the fate of their populations, not only their own countries suffer, but the whole world suffers. This challenge is now at the top of the world's agenda. What LaRouche tirelessly talked about, the inevitability of the global financial crisis, comparable in its effects to thermonuclear war, stemming from the inflation of gigantic financial speculative bubbles to a critical size, is now being talked about by experts on every continent. Paul Krugman and Mark Mobius, George Soros and Mervyn King, and the analysts of the Bank of England, the World Bank, Bank of America, among many others. The enormous financial debt of not only the weak countries of the third world, but also the leading economies of the planet, which is the most important thing, is turning the world economy into a powder keg, which inevitably will explode in the near future. According to data from the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the American debt in 2019 was $23 trillion, which is 135% of their GDP. Japan has a debt of $13 trillion, which is 295% of their GDP, and UK has a $2.7 trillion debt, while the World Bank stated that the maximum permissible debt level for a country was 77% of GDP. But let us return to Ukraine. Ukraine fully implemented all of the IMF's demands. The state sector of the economy was dismantled with mass privatization, and the National Bank was no longer subordinated to the government, and a system of commercial banks was established, within which the smallest banks are regularly shut down. Simultaneously, we had the deregulation of prices. The currency exchange rate and foreign trade and all conditions were created for the formation and enrichment of a Ukrainian oligarchy. Another boost to their capital was the cheap labor model imposed by the West. based on an artificial understatement of the official minimum subsistence level of income, which was set at only 20 to 25% of the real cost of living, which in turn led to meager wage and pension levels and pitifully low social benefits. Macroeconomic stability was evaluated exclusively by the reduction of the budget deficit through cuts in funding for healthcare and education, and for culture and sports, and through constant increases in utility rates justified by the mantra that they needed to be raised to market levels and that the government should be removed from any regulation of prices in food, medicine, and vital necessities. And all of this led to a constant understrained rise of the cost of living. And the great majority of the population was deprived of the ability to cover the cost of living with their income. So it is no surprise that Ukraine ranks last out of all 42 European countries in purchasing power of the population. These statistics were published in October 2019 in the study Purchasing Power Europe 2019 by the data analysis company GfK. On average, the GfK, an income of a resident of Europe in 2019 is 14,739 euros, while the average Ukrainian has an income of eight times less. And Ukraine's economic policy is determined by the shared interests of the Ukrainian oligarchs and the international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the World Trade Organization, and others, which in turn expresses the interests of the ruling circles in the leading countries of the West. They don't need Ukraine as a competitor or an equal partner. LaRouche has warned they have no interest in the development of the national economy or its very basis, physical economy and material production. They are interested in having a large market for their goods and services so as to increase their own profits. They need Ukraine as a supplier of raw materials for their companies and of super cheap, highly skilled labor. The plans of the West also include taking over Ukraine's very territory. Remember that this is a country in the geographical center of Europe, an important transit juncture for the continent of Eurasia, with outlets to 2 seas and a great number of rivers, lakes, and large forest areas. Of particular importance is our wealth of arable land, 19% of all the farmland of Europe, and black earth, 8.7% of the world's black earth soil. Therefore, the Western orchestrators of the reforms in Ukraine, along with the Ukrainian oligarchs, are absolutely indifferent to the suffering of our people, which led to a horrific scale of labor immigration from Ukraine. At least 10 million people over the past 5 years have left the country, and negative natural population growth. The death rate is almost double the birth rate. The outcome is that the population of Ukraine has fallen from 52 million people at the time of independence in 1991 to 30 million people. Experts have been raising the alarm for a long time, and that is their estimate of the real population of the country. But government statistics continue to cover it up, stating that the population is 42 million, not counting Crimea or the self-proclaimed Donbas republics. And the current Speaker of the Parliament, Dmytro Razunkov, however, had to acknowledge the real state of affairs, where he argued in September 2019 in favor of amending the constitution of Ukraine to reduce the number of people's deputies in the parliament from 450 to 300. And today the Ukrainian economy is a sorry spectacle. The GDP in 2018 was at only 2/3 the level of 1991. And Ukraine's GDP was 1/6 that of Argentina, 1/5 of the GDP of Poland, and half that of Portugal. And according to IMF figures for 2018, average GDP per capita worldwide was $11,730. While in advanced countries, in developed countries, it is $48.970, and $5,000, and in the developing countries, it is $5,490, and in Ukraine it was only 2,820, which is 2 times lower than the than in the developing countries. So. GDP is a monetary category, and what is hidden behind all of this? How much precisely and what goods did the country produce in this time period? Having obeyed the IMF and getting approval from the USA of its actions, Ukraine actually experienced a total economic catastrophe. Let's look at picture 1, illustration 1. This first graph shows, we need graph 1, that shows the decline of Ukraine's share in world population, in world production of the most important raw materials for the metallurgical industries. With the exception of rutile concentrate, production of all other components collapsed very deeply. The red bar shows the share of world population in 1992, and the blue bar is for 2018. So did output of pig iron and steel. And over the past 5 years, from 2013 to 2018, steel output fell by nearly 1/3, from 30.6 million tons in 2014 to 21.1 million tons in 2018. Pig iron fell by 20%, from 25 million tons in 2013 to 20.5 million tons in 2018. Yet this is strategically important sector for Ukraine. Steel and other metallurgy companies account for 30% of Ukraine's total industrial production and 25% of our exports. And the second graph shows the condition of Ukraine's industry, with rising indexes starting back in January of 2010. And it is clear that the industry is comatose. It's disappearing from our country that used to be an industrial power. Industry's share in Ukraine's GDP has fallen by more than 1/2, from the 44% of 1991 to the 20% of 2018, while the share of machine building in industrial output also declined by nearly 1/2, and from 31% in 1991 to 15% in 2018, and this share of innovation-based products sold within total industrial production has fallen by a factor of 13 just since the beginning of this century, from 9.4% in the year 2000 to 0.7% in 2017, and the index of industrial production in January and August 2019 is this is our current year. All of the industrial production as a whole is continuing to collapse. Over the past 8 months has fallen by 9%, and the overall amount of decline happens in machine building and energy sector. With over past 5 years, we have seen a 1/4 decline from the 200 billion kilowatt hours in 2013 to 150 billion kilowatt hours in 2018. I will give you another couple of figures from machine building. In 1991, our leading aircraft manufacturer Antonov produced 250 airplanes, but this year, in 2019, they have not produced a single airplane. 10 years ago, Ukraine managed to produce 423,000 automobiles, but a decade later now, the number is only it's like 50 times less. The figure is 8,600. And other figures also The number of cattle has fallen from 25.2 million heads in 1990 to 3.7 million in 2019, only 1/7 of the previous herd, and nobody takes responsibility for this catastrophe. LaRouche stood up precisely against the destruction of the physical economy. That is why he advocated building transport corridors of development from the Atlantic to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and put forward head-spinning ideas about developing the moon and making flights to Mars. What for? For advanced technologies to develop more rapidly and productive capital to dominate rather than speculative capital, and the activity of the banking sector would be reorganized accordingly. The state would invest in the development of infrastructure, creating the needed conditions for the development of the power industry, transport, industrial production. In other words, the state would be responsible for the development of physical economy as the basis of the entire economic system. Lyndon LaRouche, as an outstanding economist, philosopher, and politician, drew our attention not only to the causes on the scale of the economic upheavals, but also to the political consequences of the destruction of the existing monetary system. He warned that the oligarchy would call for a policy of strict austerity and would establish fascist dictatorships. Therefore, it was essential that progressive humanity defeat the oligarchy and free ourselves once and for all from that parasitical system. And now all mankind has seen the rebirth of fascism and Nazism in Ukraine. I spoke about this openly at my press conference in the European Parliament on February 26 in 2014, immediately after the coup d'etat in Ukraine, in Kiev. Once again, I want to thank our co-thinkers from the Schiller Institute, many of you are here today, both for organizing our trip to Europe at that time and for organizing that press conference. The further development of events completely confirmed our assessment. It was the Nazi, Russophobic coloration of the Euromaidan that led to the loss of Crimea and set the stage for the fighting in Slavyansk and the monstrous attack on the anti-fascists in the Odessa House of Trade Unions, and brought on the fratricidal war in the Donbass. This was a war that continued for 5.5 years and took the lives of over 13,000 lives, and including civilians, women, old people, children. Hundreds of thousands have been wounded or psychologically traumatized. Ukraine is afflicted by the Nazi militants. They are armed, well-trained, and well-funded. They carry out acts of intimidation, raid seizures of premises all over Ukraine. Under Ukraine's new President Zelensky, they are holding the entire population in fear, terrorizing the entire country. Instead of rooting out Nazism and banning all Nazi parties and movements, the Ukrainian government has, to the contrary, made a Nazi ideology official and is fighting against leftist parties and anti-fascist organizations. 6,000 of our compatriots are in prison as dissidents. And the persecution of our Progressive Socialist Party in Ukraine is we are seen as an opposition party, and our party headquarters and the editorial offices of our party newspaper have been seized 3 years ago and have not been returned to us. Law enforcement agencies refuse to investigate the attacks by the Nazis against the leaders of our party and on party demonstrations, and those responsible have never been brought to justice. And the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine has blocked the operations of our party by not officially registering the documents of now 5 of our congresses, while court decisions in our favor have been met with defiance and simply not implemented. And throughout the years since the coup in 2014, we have done everything in our power to bring the truth about Ukraine to the world. But there has not been any proper reaction on the part of the international community. And this cannot continue forever. Now, at last, Europe is beginning to sound an alarm. 1 year ago, in October 25th, 2018, the European Parliament passed a resolution titled On the Rise of Neo-Fascist Violence in Europe, in which they were forced to observe that openly neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, racist and xenophobic groups and political parties are inciting hatred and violence in society, reminding us of what they were capable of in the past. At that time, the European Parliament adopted sweeping recommendations to the nations of Europe. I will cite 2 of the 32 of this points of this resolution. Point 9 calls on the member states to strongly condemn and sanction hate crime, hate speech and scapegoating by politicians and public officials at all levels and all types of media, as they directly normalize and reinforce hatreds and violence in society. And point 12 calls on the member states to investigate and prosecute hate crimes and to share best practices for identifying and investigating hate crimes, including those motivated specifically by the various forms of xenophobia. As we can see, LaRouche was right in this regard too. The IMF economic reforms, which destroyed material production or the physical economy, led to a political coup and to Nazism and to fascism. Of course, all possible approaches and the world's entire experience must be employed to defend mankind, the population of Ukraine included, from Nazism, fascism and xenophobia. Without this, the world cannot be saved or transformed. Lyndon LaRouche gave us the knowledge which we are obliged to use for the salvation of humanity. Thank you very much for your attention.